Let's get close, but not so close. Quarantine. You can share from a distance. Quarantine. You know we want to see each other. You'll have to stay in your quarantine space while we talk.
It's episode 37. 37 times we've convened here during this lockdown or our attempts to flee it to consider how we have changed, what we're doing to ourselves, and what might come next. Welcome to Quarantine this Friday afternoon. And we call today's show, it's a show on being deeply intertwingled. It's a show on transition design, on the kind of thinking that probably is the thinking we're going to need to get out of the COVID situation, to reimagine the economy, to think through how we plan our cities, the form of integrated systems thinking that was imagined in the 1960s and before, but is suddenly becoming part of how we look at the world today. And we have a couple of wonderful guests to join us, all colleagues of our co-host Mickey's. I just want to say something about where did this term intertwingled come from? It's a great term. It was actually invented by Ted Nelson. Ted Nelson was a pioneer of the popularization of computing and imagined things like word processing and hypermedia very early on. And in Computer Lib and Dream Machines, which were written in the 1970s, Ted got frustrated that knowledge was siloed and segmented. Let's go back one slide for a second. He was upset that knowledge was siloed and segmented. And so well before hypertext, a term, by the way, that he invented, well before the Berners-Lee and the web, but after Vannevar Bush in 1945 had ranted that all of knowledge needed to be connected coming out of World War II because there's too much of it, Ted says all knowledge ought to be deeply intertwingled, non-hierarchical. That's Ted setting it up on the computer basis. Then this was in his book. We can go on to the next slide. This is Computer Libs and Dream Machines, in which he's like, these machines could be liberating and powerful. So kind of at the same time that Ted Nelson is imagining all of this in the computer realm, it's also showing up in the systems realm, the fact that our whole world is interconnected. Well, let's take us to December of 2019. This last December, The Long Now, which Stuart Brand leads and Danny Hillis is part of, Stuart tweeted out a quote from Danny Hillis. Danny Hillis writes, "Unlike the Enlightenment, where progress was analytic and came from things being taken apart, progress in the age of entanglement is synthetic and comes from putting things together." A notion that the Enlightenment, which was all about kind of the atomization and the silos of things, now it's much more connected up. And The Long Now tweets out this second notion of, if we go from deeply intertwingled to entanglement, which really has to do with it's a physics term. The Long Now says we can no longer see ourselves as separate from the natural world or our technology, but as part of them, integrated, codependent, and entangled. And what's the very first tweet back to Stuart Brand? Somebody goes, intertwingled. Again, the theme for our show. And the final thing I'll bring up kind of in the preface is all of this also is a setup to other great thinkers. When we think of systems thinking, Buckminster Fuller comes to mind. Buckminster Fuller, who starting in the 1920s, talked about how you had to think of things as deeply interconnected. He coined the term spaceship Earth, made us first realize that, look, that there's a finite set of resources on the planet, and we have to think about how everything's hooked together, right? This is just the fundamental change between perhaps pre-20th century thinking that the world was limitless and needed to be tamed, and the post-looking at the moon thinking that it all hooks together. And we're going to get into this deeply. Mickey, welcome.
Hey, Peter.
Hi.
Hopefully the internet's working for me okay today. I might be a little time delayed. I never know. I think it's kind of interesting. You mentioned Ted Nelson. So he was actually working on something around cyberspace, this crazy idea that was percolating in that era. Up till last year, I was a fellow, a research fellow at a place called Autodesk. The very first research fellow for Autodesk, funded by Carol Bartz when she was CEO of Autodesk, was Ted Nelson. She was funding him and his Xanadu initiative. And Xanadu was this notion of kind of really taking cyberspace for real. And it was a very different vision than what we have today, which is the web, which is sort of one-directional links and a whole bunch of stuff that came from someone else who had a card table at the Hypertext conference who wanted to show off a different approach, which led to something called HTML and Mozilla and the rest. And so Ted Nelson had a slightly different variation on that. It was all about this intertwingling. And then our two guests today are I'm super excited to have them. Dutch has been a partner and co-brain, co-conspirator, co-thinker and doer of mine for more than a decade. And he runs Maya, the lab that is now part of BCG and part of BCG Platinion. And Terry Irwin is a design leader that I've always just felt blessed to even know about from Carnegie Mellon, who has a deep history in sort of what design is and how do you use design as a different literacy. So I'm super excited about our two guests. Why don't we bring them on today just to sort of introduce them, and then we'll drill in on the topic.
That's great. Welcome, Terry, and welcome, Dutch. And Terry, you lead at Carnegie Mellon new Transition Design Institute. Tell us a little bit of what we're transitioning to and what you're getting at, because this seems to be a very contemporary take on systems thinking, but also one that says there are an awful lot of transitions, economic, social, environmental, that we have to make that maybe we're not prepared to make and have to learn how to make.
Yeah, thank you, Peter, and thank you, Mickey. Yeah, I think this idea of transitioning, and that means entire systems, socio-technical systems, entire societies, is a meme that is sort of bubbling up all around the world right now. If you go looking on the internet, you will find any number of major initiatives that have been formed around this idea that we must intentionally transition toward different long-term, more sustainable, more equitable, more desirable long-term futures. And so transition design was really born out of an awareness of this large imperative in the 21st century. Many would argue it's the great work of the 21st century. And the need for designers, especially, to have a seat at that table and acquire new skills and knowledge associated with what it means to intentionally intervene in a system and maybe change its trajectory. But also, it was born out of the desire to develop tools and methodologies that could be placed in the hands of transdisciplinary teams who were engaged in this work of trying to shift the system's trajectories that we're in.
And welcome, Dutch. And Mick, why don't you tell us a little bit about your history with Dutch and the company you started?
That would just go nowhere fast because we would end up speaking for like the next 3 hours. Dutch and I originally met because Dutch originally was an architect, a brick and mortar architect and design leader, had his own studio, and was doing a really massive redesign of a very important public space, the Carnegie Library and Museum system. And really said, look, all the programming people come to us and tell us that we need so many shelves and so many carousels and so many areas to have books and all that, but we don't know what people need when they walk in the door. We don't know what people need when they leave, when they go out into the community again. How might we understand what the information architecture is that layers on top of the physical architecture? And we ended up collaborating and doing something I think that turned out to be pretty powerful and profound around having an information architecture that layered over what personas, what archetypal people might need, at different states in the transitional spaces, if we use the new terminology, as they were moving. When you're leaving, you don't care about book time that's going on in 5 minutes. You care about where to drop a book off next week. When you're walking in the door, you might care about bestsellers. And so Dutch and I started collaborating in that way. And then later I convinced him, I think foolishly for him, to leave Edge Architecture and join Maya and help us look at the design of emerging companies. And he helped us spin out a number of the Maya startups and really look at the system of interdisciplinary thinkers and how do you actually keep one of those things running and do it in a for-profit way, and keep it in a way that it thrives. And so Dutch, I'm super happy that you're here. Can you give us a little of your background?
Sure, thanks, Mickey. And as you mentioned, I started life as a bricks and mortar architect, and very early on in my career started this company. And Peter, you mentioned Bucky Fuller, of course, and thinking about how I viewed architecture as a systems problem was really sort of the basis of how I started to get engaged with Mickey. But as we're taught as architects, and in that process, you're really taught about systems almost absent the interconnectedness or the intertwining that you have talked about here. And one of the things that really shocked me is that I never really thought about the humans in the system very much. Right? You think about buildings and their place in cities, and you bring all of these kind of collaborators together to make this thing, but oftentimes you're not even really understanding like what is that impact on people's emotional well-being, their health, their wellness, et cetera. And so I think one of the things I was really looking towards when I started working with Mick was like, how do we start to think of these things in a much broader way? When I pull one thread, when I create an experience for somebody, or we try to work in this system called, for example, a library, which had a very kind of rigorous way of moving materials around without any idea of how it impacted people or what it meant to their lives, or layering technology without thinking about, how does that technology actually change the system? So I think, it was a really interesting way to start thinking about what, Bucky Fuller called, comprehensive participatory design science, which is something that Mickey also talks about in some of the other founders of Maya.
One of the best or perhaps worst examples of how design affects people and isn't thought about, Mickey, was the episode we did on hip-hop architecture.
Yeah.
With remind me,
Michael.
Michael.
Michael was interesting. So he's an African-American architect who pointed out that only 2% of architects in America are African-American male, and only 0.2% are African-American female. And he basically said that hip-hop architecture, hip-hop music, is a post-occupancy survey. It basically is telling you how wrong these cities are for these people who live in the city. They are telling you in hip-hop lyrics just the craziness of Detroit, the craziness of LA, the craziness of that giant, stadium in New York. And yeah, it was a very powerful episode because he talked about how he's bringing high school kids from around the world, and they're decoding hip hop lyrics, and they're bringing in hip hop architects as well, Lupe Fiasco and others, that really have this whole coalition of people who are poets, and they're looking at the meter and the rhyme and the language, and then turning them into buildings and turning them into centers, and then exploring how to build them and how he might create a movement of what he called hip hop architecture, where we actually shaped the spaces we lived. And that was a very powerful moment. I don't think I would have been prepared, though. I'll say this. I mean, we were prepared to have that episode, maybe because of my long history of really learning about architecture as a complex system from Dutch and from his team, and from understanding that architecture is actually one of the wonderful disciplines that does teach system thinking. But often, if you look at the cover of an architectural digest or architectural record, there are no humans. The pretty picture is like the beautiful picture. It's got maybe trees. But you don't really hear about, did it actually increase cognitive diversity within the space? Did it actually increase connections and serendipitous connections in the space? You don't hear about the more human and tangible elements. And I think that's what we ended up,
Mickey, sorry, the other scale, you often don't see it in context of a city or the system of a city.
Yeah.
It's very much about an object, or very much about sort of, the imagery, and not about how it's impacting its place in the city, and what happens within that whole system, or the larger system.
And I wanted
I
to bring
would
this up.
say, just to wait before we go past this, just point, and this is how life works on this show. We just it's a dinner table conversation. So, but real quick, there's a wonderful book called Palaces of the People, and they look at exploration of social architecture, social infrastructure. And what's beautiful about this book is that the author, who's an epidemiologist and a sociologist, says that if a bunch of people got together and brainstormed about like some new cool innovation that would be great for a city to confer resilience post-disaster, post-whatever, you couldn't do much better than a public library. It's a peer-to-peer network, which is now all the rage in computing. It's massively distributed. Everything has a copy. Everything can request a book. Everything can get a book. And it actually ends up being something that works for multiple generations of people. And neighborhoods with a library that's a thriving library, or even a thriving barbershop, a thriving beauty salon, outperformed neighborhoods that didn't, in terms of people who survived from a heat wave, in terms of people who survived after a hurricane or a tornado. Just, it's an incredible piece of architecture, but it's about the social infrastructure that accretes around it. And I get the impression that's a lot of what Terry and Dutch are more focused on. It's sort of the verbs in between. This intertwingling and transition is about the movement. It's not about the thing. And I don't know, Terry, or maybe Terry, if you could explain a little bit more about transition design and why you called it, the Transition Design Institute. I would be fascinated to hear more about that.
Yeah, sure. Well, it really arose in 2014 as we were trying to redesign all of the curricula in the School of Design at the undergrad, master, and doctoral levels. My husband and partner, Gideon Kossoff, had actually proposed it as a term and a possible area of design focus in his PhD dissertation from 2011. But Gideon and I were actually living in Totnes, England in 2005, I think it was 5, when Rob Hopkins convened the very first meeting of the Transition Town Network. I don't know how many people will be familiar with that, but it's now become a global network of cities who are trying to regain semi-autonomy, live more sustainably, place, and network. And as I mentioned before, we became increasingly aware of this whole idea or meme of the need to intentionally transition entire systems toward more sustainable futures. And simultaneously, we began to think deeply about what are the largest, what we call wicked problems, Horst Rittel's term, confronting us in the 21st century. And we absolutely believe that wicked problems cannot be solved by any single group of individuals or any single discipline, that it is inherently, it needs a systematic approach that will involve multiple people from multiple disciplines, as well as the stakeholders affected by the problem, working together in concert at multiple levels of scale over multiple horizons of time to begin to resolve them. And I've been a designer for my whole life. I ran an international design firm called Meta Design for many years and was engaged in what I would call expert-led design. Designer is expert. You know, we're the main experts in the room. We're framing problems. We're bringing all of our expertise, our methodologies, our processes, and our disciplinary norms to bear on a problem which is usually clearly defined and finite. That seemed to us to be in contrast to what was needed to solving this different type of problem. So we proposed to set out to constitute a new transdisciplinary territory of focus that could educate generations of designers to join these transdisciplinary teams that were engaged in this very high systems level work to address these problems, but also to ask, are the tools and methodologies that designers use to create tangible, often material or digital or hybridized solutions in the world, would those be useful to these transdisciplinary teams engaged in this long problem-solving process? So that's what transition design was constituted to do. It is decidedly not expert design-led process. And it runs a couple of arguments. One really important one is that all stakeholders affected by the problem must be identified. And I would argue that many design-led processes identify key stakeholder groups and often privilege some over others. But transition design argues that stakeholder groups are always both human and non-human. So there are always going to be stakeholders whose voices and concerns cannot be heard. So advocates must be designated to get those concerns into the problem mix. It also argues that these problems took a very long time to become wicked, and they are going to take a very long time to resolve. And as a designer of 40-odd years, you know, a long problem in design years might go on for 2, 3, 4 years. I think urban planners definitely get the gold star for hanging in there the longest. But transition design projects would run for dozens of years, if not decades. And so part of the inquiry it opens up is, how do we develop an approach that will go for that long? And where does the continuity come from? And we argue it won't come from outside consultants like us. It must come from within the system. So what is an approach for leveraging the knowledge and the wisdom and experience from within the system, so that we consultants come in service in a decidedly different posture to enable the work of the system, I guess.
What are examples of things that actually, projects that persist for decades and like continue to move forward? I mean, you got me there when you talked, because, you know, I was thinking in terms of, okay, we have a community build. It takes about a few years to entitle something and a few more years to build it. But you're talking about the transition of energy systems or the transition of forms of capitalism. These things go on for decades. And do they go on naturally, or because there's some intentional group that's continuing to design it, ask questions, call for reviews? Well, I'm kind of interested in how long-term things get managed or happened in this way of looking at it.
So good examples, you mean? Yeah, Terry, what about that?
Well, I think you could probably look to many pre-industrial societies that mounted decade-long projects. You know, the cathedrals took entire lifetimes to build, the pyramids. And I think intentionality has a lot to do with it, because it's important to remember that our societies are always in transition. And the thing is, we only understand the ramifications of these pervasive transitions in hindsight, and we call it history. So what we're really talking about is, can we intentionally change the trajectory of these transitions we're already in to aim them at more desirable and equitable long-term futures? Because we're transitioning right now, but it's through drift. And it's largely unintentional. So I think that is the question.
This also brings up, you know, we were talking about the long now a moment ago. This completely puts on the table the need for long-term thinking and the human propensity for now, right? Jim Fallows gave a talk at the Long Now about infrastructure, and his point was infrastructure, dams or subways or roads, are as much a gift for our grandkids as for what we'll get in a few years when they get built. And this also brings to mind just, I don't know, the political divide. You know, I think, well, I think it's pretty true to say that like long-term thinking or systems thinking picks up people on the left, people who understand or appreciate that small inputs bring about big outputs. You know, whether it's climate change issues or the ozone layer. These people who like. I mean, when you start thinking that way, then you're like, we better make interventions and bring about change. And people on the right are like, no, we don't like that. We let's keep it a little bit more like it is, and we like a more linear model. And this is, I guess, only gotten worse. So I guess the other interesting question is, the for this kind of thinking to work, it would work best if people came together and at least agreed on a problem and it was a project. How do you encounter the fact that this very form of thinking is politically charged?
Peter, it's funny because I don't really think of it as left or right.
Yeah,
I think of it more as maybe it's the systems that we work in are very much geared towards short-term gain. If we look at the economic system that we're in, companies can barely look beyond next quarter, right? And so I think it transcends politics in a lot of ways. It goes sort of to the heart of the economic system to say, like, hey, we are looking for results now. We're going to make decisions that will, we know, in the long term be harmful to ourselves, our employees, our clients, our customers, whoever, right? Or for the government, but we have to do it. And even if you look at the way like elections, like every 4 years or every 2 years, you're looking at, I need results within that time frame. So I think there's a lot of systematic things in place, layers that transcend just sort of like the left-right argument.
By the way,
I wanted to bring in real quick a comment from Roz, who's one of our viewers right now, Rosalind Kama, and Rosalind leads the sort of Society of Interior Design work, and she's part of a group that I'm a board member of around evidence-based healthcare design and a 25-year effort to really look at evidence. And she points out that we know that the built environment actually shapes our behavior quite a lot. And how do we look at how different movements actually shift our behaviors? And I think that there's something really powerful in that question as well, is sort of, we know that these are feedback loops. Not only is there a time scale, a sort of pace layering, as maybe the Long Now would call it, of different pace layers, but there's also a feedback loop mechanism where even if I want to do something for 25 years, the act of building something is actually going to start shaping behaviors in a new way. And I need to be sensitive to the behaviors that are even the transitional behaviors. Am I actually increasing well-being? Am I reducing well-being? Am I building something that will be better? I think, Terry, you pointed to churches and cathedrals as one good example of 100-year efforts. Think of Antonio Gaudi's Sagrada Familia. They're just now about to finish it. But what was interesting is they relied on religion, so ritual, to shape a continuing effort to look up. It's the sort of the opposite of a bazaar where people are playing in the streets for thousands of years in Marrakesh, and they're never any better. A bazaar is interesting in one direction, a market, but the cathedral is interesting in another direction because it forces you to look up. It forces you to kind of aspire to something. And there's a whole collection of these behavioral things. How do we do, like, what's the designer's role, or what's the agent's role, whoever the agent is, if not expert design, right? Because you said you're coming with a different posture. What is the role of the agent involved in trying to actually get intentional change to happen, if not religion, if not ritual, or does it require ritual design, or require some other thing that, where like songs carried, forth really good signals about not eating certain things, or about, the flu or something, or whatever. What is the role of these kind of very intangible things that actually are very viral in culture over these long periods of time?
Yeah.
If not religion or something.
Well, I think it's a brilliant question. And I might recast it as narrative. Religion in one way is narrative. Tradition is narrative. And I think that what we're lacking right now are powerful and rigorous narratives about the future. we just tend to think of it in very squishy terms, and there's a variety of opinions about it. It's fixed and inevitable, or it's just impenetrable. And I think that you can see evidence of change in the proliferation of new methodologies around foresighting, around futuring and vision. And one of the things that we've tried to integrate very deeply into transition design is the idea of co-created long-term visions. So the idea that stakeholders affected by a particular problem come together despite their conflicting agendas, despite the fact that sometimes they want to strangle each other. You help them pull up and out of the present in which they can't agree on what the problem even is, let alone try and solve it. But you ask them what the long-term future would look like had the problem been resolved. Right. How would you live differently, play differently, go about meeting your needs differently? What would be possible that's not possible now? And we find that in that kind of space in which you're not worried about how to get there, but you imagine what if, people can come to amazing degrees of agreement. And I think part of the role of the perhaps experts, I mean, my core discipline is communication design, Dutch's is architecture, we all have our various expertise. How do we then come together to scaffold those visions of the stakeholders to reframe the problem and create a compelling narrative about that long-term future that acts as both a motivator to action, but also a roadmap or compass for how to get there? And I think that this visioning ought to become an ongoing process, not something fixed and static.
We did a show a few shows ago on kind of how the 20th century was built around narratives like this. And kind of the conceit of our show was, if one were to imagine a World's Fair today, a place that you would both go to see the future, what would it be? Well, one thing we realized is you wouldn't go see it, you'd co-create it. Everyone would have to be a stakeholder in it, or else they wouldn't agree. And besides, they made it, they'd buy it.
It wouldn't be General Motors, General Dynamics, General this. It wouldn't be the big corporations telling you what your vision of the future is. Very different than 1939. And I do think that's an interesting question. And where Terry's going, I think this idea of a narrative that has a longer term point of view, it also reminds me of Steve Jurvetson in one of our episodes called The Inevitables. He said he looks at what is inevitable morally, ethically, and practice 50 years ahead. Will we eat the skin of or the muscles of cows in a giant factory farm in 50 years? Would we really want to do that? Probably not. So he invests in Memphis meat, which is motherless cows, and says, I'm only going to invest in inevitable. And of course, none of this is inevitable, right? It's not that evolution or anything else is guided towards a better society. We have to do it ourselves. And that's where the narrative, I think, comes in. What were you going to go to?
Terry, what I really love what Terry was saying was this idea of we're not doing this speculative vision and then we're done, right? So what Terry said is it's continual visioning, right? It's recursive. And so what I think she's saying is like you motivate and you get people aligned and kind of like thinking like we have a better place to go with that narrative. But then I think it's really important as you don't lay out the roadmap and execute and it's done, right? Not on these time scales. But what it is
constant learning, constant change.
Feeding that back in. Absolutely.
But who has the commitment to do that? I do think that there's a real challenge. Dutch, you articulated it. The current value of things is based on what the market will bear, right? Which is a very sort of simplistic idea of value theory, but it's the only thing taught now. It's very different than what Adam Smith might have taught, which is where he would teach both about the moral values and the invisible hand. We don't teach any of that today. We don't teach about the real value of longer term thinking. At the Long Now, they talk about how at Cambridge or Oxford, when the cathedral master noticed that the main beam in the cathedral was getting worn out by termites or something like that. He mentioned it to the forestry head, and the forestry head said, "Oh yeah, I planted a tree. We planted a tree 400 years ago. It's probably about ready to be harvested to put in there."
Mhm.
Like they explicitly thought beyond
Yeah.
a generation. And what is the modus? Like what is the maybe either economic force or cultural force that will get us to think at this different layer? And or what have you found, either Terry or Dutch, in terms of ways that you can keep the flame alive, you know, during setbacks, or ways that you can keep the conversation moving in a positive direction during, you know, during the inevitable rises and falls that come from that time horizon?
Well, I would say that it would be very interesting to do a study on how human horizons of time have shrunk increasingly with the industrialization of the modern world. I mean, pre-industrialization, humans were absolutely embedded in nature. They depended on it, absolutely. The feedback loops were very short. And the rhythms of the natural world helped set our time clock. Increasingly, we've become completely separated from that. We live in our own environments of our own making. We can ignore the seasons and, you know, the bigger rhythms of the climate, although the climate is bearing down on us, as we see. And I would argue that the pandemic is actually directly connected to deforestation and our increased you know, intervention into natural systems. I would be very curious to know how many of us who have gone into quarantine, I mean, we're at day 144 without leaving the house significantly, we have had to slow down our rhythms. And I can't believe how much more aware we are of the birds and the natural rhythms around us. And there is something in that, I think, that we need to take on board. And I'm a paid member of the Long Now Foundation, and I do believe that one of the wicked problems we're facing in the 21st century is the fact that humanity is thinking in ever shorter horizons of time. And it is stripping away knowledge. It is stripping away intuitive knowledge that we're born with and have taught out of us. And these are things we talk explicitly to our students about now. I don't have an answer, but I have a lot of questions that I think we should be posing to students in
and you make
university.
the point that one thing that leads to this is the thing that we're tied to that drives our system loop or our feedback are not the natural systems, but artificial things that we've built, right? If you're living in a world where you're in agriculture, you're deeply close, you know what's going on with the natural systems and how the soil shift changes.
Yeah.
If you're tied to stuff that comes over on a boat from China and then goes to Walmart, and you're
We're sort
unaware
of disconnected by proxy too much.
Yes.
Yeah.
You know, Larry Harvey, who died recently and ran Burning Man, loved this theme, and he kept coming back to themes at Burning Man that would try to get people to get these things. And one of my favorite was the year that the theme was cargo cult. Cargo cults, of course, were these World War II. They were like Aborigines, and all of a sudden in their areas, all the cargo came and wealth came because the boats came, and then they left, and so they would just worship and hope to invoke this. And his point is, this is how we relate to the China supply chain or whatever. And one thing the pandemic has done, in addition to making us hear the birds, is it's made us actually hear where things come from, and we're more aware of that. By the way, this is a great moment to transition to some of your COVID work. But the point you make about narrative, right? And Mickey, this began because you brought up religion. And then Terry kind of said, well, actually, religion is a form of narrative. When we had Raphael Lozano-Hemmer on the phone recently, an artist, he talked about how the important role of artists in helping us reimagine public space when we reemerge, because how we are publicly and together is a design thing that we need to through. And we had Tim Kring on. Tim is in Hollywood, created the TV show Heroes. He uses kind of the hero's journey and the arc of a lot of his shows, and he created something called the Conspiracy for Good. He was wondering, could he use social media to get a whole bunch of people to imagine some future and then collaborate and work on it, right? And these are all attempts to get how do you start bringing up the possible? Is that a cat that we hear?
It's great.
Sammy.
Sammy, we hear something pleading for a long-term future, no doubt in the background.
He's a stakeholder. He should be at the table. He's going to
Yes.
sue at some point the human servant union who serves him if they don't give him food soon. I think Tim Craig's thing was interesting. He did that thing where it was a conspiracy for good, where people had to use early social media technology. 2008, if anyone remembers Heroes on NBC, it's a fascinating throwback if you want to binge, because it actually is pre all these media things. So everyone uses like Sony Handycams for social media and everything. But he did a conspiracy where people had to actually go around and geolocate real clues in London over the course of a season after Heroes. And if you found the clues and assembled and learned about these things, and he had real places that were set up and everything, you actually ended up winning a prize that donated a massive amount of money to build schools in Africa, or donated a massive amount of money. So in the act of you discovering the evidence, you were learning about the actual problem from the stakeholder's point of view. And then you were solving it and actually helping give it. But I wonder if there are design methods, and I'm sure there must be, that like it's a card, if I think of Brian Eno's cards, but it's a card that explicitly says, stretch the time scale out by 10 years or by 20 years or by 50 years, because I think that would be a valuable thing. I think we started to see the rise of evil design and dark design patterns when Facebook and others were able to basically amplify behavioral biases. And nobody had a card for the designers that said something like, assume you're going to actually be used by 3 billion people. How could it go wrong for some stakeholders? And I wonder is that where you're going, Terry? Is there a reason that people should look at transition design differently than how design is practiced? Like, are there places that you see that actually are new methodologies, either for research or inviting stakeholders in, or are you just at the beginning of the journey? And what are you finding in this that might help us understand the difference?
I mean, I think what we were mainly trying to do is ask, why aren't we better at solving these large, wicked problems that are interconnected and interdependent? And we came up with a few conclusions. And one is that wicked problems are systems problems situated within radically large systems contexts. And yet, most traditional problem-solving approaches are aimed at drawing as tight a problem frame around a problem as possible, because if you do that, and I did it for decades, you can solve the problem easily, quickly, and profitably with the experience you already have. So there's a huge pressure to do just that. I can solve a problem the same way every time. I just crank it through my little process machine. But what that does is it solves for symptoms of much larger problems. And that's why nothing ever changes, or it's why so many of the design solutions that we create don't work exactly the way that we think they do, and they unravel in a matter of years. What we think is called for is framing problems in radically large context, which makes them horrible. You can't solve it quickly, you can't solve it profitably, and you've got to stick with that sucker for a really long time. And it's everything we don't want to do. It's everything we work really hard not to do. But we think it's the only way to really solve the problem. So I think what transition design has brought is maybe just an argument that says these radically large problem frames have to include how the problem's manifesting in the present, but we've got to go way back into history and ask, how did that sucker evolve over decades, if not hundreds of years? And then if we want to transition to something else, what does that long-term future look like? So you now got a problem frame that includes the past, the present,
Mm.
and the future. Holy crap, what do you do with that? Now, we are not so interested in coming up with an approach that's branded and proprietary and, it's the next hammer and, if you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. What we're more interested in is if we can agree that these problem frames have to get radically large, then there's a lot of existing methodologies that can be used in different stages along that process to help develop systems interventions, but there are probably new approaches. There are new methodologies and tools that need to be developed to do just that. And that's what transition design is engaged in. And from the beginning, we've just shared everything that we've done in the hopes of jumpstarting a global conversation, and whether somebody calls it transition design or not, doesn't matter. It's like, can we figure out how to solve systems problems, which are going to take a whole different posture for collaboration and a whole different way of being in the world.
Terry, you've postulated as a system problem, perhaps the greatest problem we're all facing today, which is COVID, and I want to go, Omid, you can bring this up for us. You've modeled this as all of the different pieces that play into what the wicked COVID problem is, right? So some of this is the food chain problem and the human behavior problem and the political response problem. And this strikes me as it's a classic systems way of showing this. So maybe we could zoom in and you could walk us through. First of all, what's this methodology? What's this thing we're looking at?
What are we looking at?
Yeah, what are we looking at? And then let's zoom in and understand how this unpacks all the many things that are this wicked problem.
Yeah. Well, what you're looking at here is a method we've devised. It's not the only method. It's an approach for how to begin to map a wicked problem. And ideally, a map like this would be constructed by all the stakeholder groups affected by it, as well as experts who could bring knowledge to bear. But we've identified what we think are 5 rather archetypal areas. So one area is issues connected to politics and governance. Another area is connected to science, infrastructure, and technology. Another area is connected to business issues and economic issues. The biggest area of all is always social issues. It's how we think and how we act. And then the 5th area is environmental issues. So the argument we run is that in order to understand the system, you sort of have to deconstruct it and look at all the issues in all these 5 archetypal areas. And then you start to map their interconnections. So often a lack of political will or governance is connected to ignorance about the problem in the social area. A lack of policy around environmental change is connected to business and economic issues in a very much for-profit, growth-based paradigm.
Yeah.
So mapping it
So
in
is
this
it
way,
fair to say, Terry, in this that like something like right now we're zoomed in, and Omid is zoomed in on economic and business, and it says ways in which the U.S. economy's interconnectedness with global economies contributed, and then there are some sub-arguments to that, and then those arrows I would imagine are kind of verbs. They're sort of how are they connected, and the point in some ways is just to expose all the nouns and verbs and how these things are related. And to try to get stakeholders from different aspects of these big topics. And it looks like you went pretty deep into this. I remember originally reading about this from a Fast Company article that said, CMU has made a 22-foot-long map to understand how we got where we were with COVID. And I was just like, oh, whoa, okay.
Yeah.
That's
this one
an
is
important point.
There are 2 maps here. This is the kind of big categories. And then there's another page that's kind of almost a temporal or timescale map. I don't know if we can zoom out to that. But you started in 1770. And I was like, I was shocked by that, because it implied to me that the next facilitated session I do around large scale system problems, I need to get some historians in the room as stakeholders.
Historians are key. Sorry, Peter.
You know, and I always think of people talk about futurists, but actually I think the best futurists are the ones that understand history. And it made me think of like, where the heck are the historians in these innovation things? You know, we always see these innovations, for instance.
Heather Cox Richardson is my heroine.
Say more about that.
Well, well, Heather Cox Richardson is a historian that writes, I think, one of the most brilliant political analyses out there. And you can get an email from her every day. And she analyzes what we are going through as a nation every day based on history. And so this second map that you're looking at, after we map it in the present and we try to understand the interconnections and feedback loops, we identify key issues. That's what the red boxes are. And we say, how did these issues evolve? And figuring out where to begin that historical evolution is a bit of an art form. But what motivated us to start in 1770 was we started doing this research in March. And despite the science, despite everything, you started seeing this mass protest against the quarantine. And we said, you know, there is something hardwired into the American response here. It's a uniquely American response that began with the framing of our Constitution and our belief in civil liberties and the right to bear arms. And we wanted to go back that far. And then when you've done a historic map like this, what you don't see here is the lecture that I eventually did, where I overlaid present news articles and photographs about the uniquely American response that corresponds to so much of what you see in this historic timeline. So what the transition design approach argues is that by going back and trying to understand how the problem evolved in the first place, it reveals insights about how it's manifesting in the present. I mean, one of the biggest surprises I had was there's many facets of the problem on here. And one, of course, is the broken American healthcare system. And what we found out is the American Medical Association, from its founding, got in bed with big pharma for money. And so when if you're an advocate of socialized medicine, or you think anything related to socialized medicine ought to happen in the US, the American Medical Association is going to thwart that every time for all kinds of reasons that are not difficult to get at. This was only 3 people mapping this. But what you would ideally have is many different experts, historians, policy people, people that are very connected to how the infrastructure in this country evolved, looking at the interconnections. Anything related to the pandemic, we colored red. And what you can see in this very inadequate, toe in the water kind of research here is that pandemics have always existed. We've known about coronavirus since the 60s. And we've known that it's directly connected to deforestation and wet markets. And nothing has happened because this luxury food industry now employs over a billion people. It's a multi-million dollar market. So we think unearthing the roots of systems problems like this is a kind of group sense making. It's a way of getting people on the same page, and it becomes a visual repository of the deepening systems knowledge about a problem like this. And what ultimately the goal is to reveal zones of opportunity in the systems problem where you can intervene and solve multiple issues simultaneously.
I noticed that one of the comments from the audience, Arvind, pointed out that he says, it sounds like transition design is not a way to solve wicked problems, using a design process, but a way to organize people around a wicked problem in an
That's it.
ongoing way. And it sounds exactly right. Yeah, I think he's really hit on it. And it's this notion of what I wanted to do, and I think the reason we even had this episode to begin with was we were like, wait, a 22-foot map, that just sounded interesting. And then I reached out to Dutch, and Dutch was like, oh yeah, Terry did that. I was like, what? Okay, wait. And then I said, could I hit initial conditions and could I hit replay? Like, could I play it out again and actually try to see which variables would have changed it, and so that I learn where to intervene in the future, right? Because you just made a big point that because of the entrenched interest and the path dependency of, maybe comfort foods, it's actually very hard to get rid of this crazy thing. Yeah. So two questions or thoughts. One, I know, Peter, you wanted to show a little something from when you were in school about being able to hit reset and hit play and reset initial conditions and kind of play out a complex system. And maybe before we do that, Terry, do you imagine that this kind of a map would not have been done in a sort of sparsely inadequate tool like PDF from the 1980s or 90s, but would have been done in a system that allowed you to accrete knowledge so that people wouldn't have to do this sense making over and over again like Groundhog Day? Or what's your, I mean, maybe I'm encoding the answer, I hope it is, but what's your thought about this? Like, where will the Transition Institute go?
Well, before, we said architecture shapes us and we shape the architecture. Well, we shape our tools and tools shape us. That was one of Marshall McLuhan's whole arguments. But I will say that after trying to map these systems in a way that will reveal leverage points for intervention, as Dana Meadows would have said, what you realize is there are no adequate tools out there. There are mind mapping tools, there are database visualization tools, but there are no adequate tools that will help us organically build a system as we build our understanding of it, and that will enlighten us in turn. And so it's no surprise to me now, after thinking about this for a decade, we aren't good at designing, and I mean design with a big D. That's not expert designers. It's all of us changing existing situations into preferred ones. It's no mystery to me that we are not able to think and design systemically because we have no tools to enable that way of working. And every single talk I give ends with a plea for if anybody is interested in developing the tools that are needed for doing this kind of work, we will raise our hands and work with you. And that is one of the things that the Transition Design Institute aspires to develop one way or another.
Oh, I love it. I want to point out Azam Khan happens to be tuned in today. He's a complexity scientist up in Toronto who has actually been working for a number of years on parametric human project on a side project, but also builds tools around multi-scale, multi-level, multi-physics exploration systems. And he makes a point today, we need bridges that go between the scales of time, a higher and longer need to carry the narrative. And it might be worthwhile to have a follow-up conversation with Azam. Azam was actually on one of our shows exploring and showing off a little bit of his new company's efforts, but he's been a researcher into complexity systems and complex systems, and really trying to understand how to make them human understandable, and also how to sense or capture telemetry so that you could do this. Because I think one of the problems is not the fixed coming up with a model. It feels like a lot of this is also when we learn new things, how do we change the model? Like how do we decide that was a downward spiral model and not a generatively outward spiral model that gives us opportunity? I do think that's a real challenge too.
Well, ultimately,
I was going to say when I first, go ahead, finish your thought. I just wanted to follow up on a point we were making earlier about these two models, but go ahead.
No, I was only going to say something short, which is ultimately all of this is about conceiving and birthing new socio-economic political paradigms.
I was going to make the point that, first of all, it's fascinating to put these two models together because one goes into all of the small things. None of them are small, but together, many individual things that make up the complexity of understanding COVID, right? That's your social and your economic and stuff.
Mhm.
But the bottom one, which starts with 1770, is your backstory, which is what is it about the unique American experience, how we've organized, what we've been through, the fact that we live on a big island and didn't think things would affect us. All of this stuff is a backstory, which leads to kind of the shared narrative that we can agree on, in fact, is the American experience. You'll get people to nod because this is kind of all of our heritage. And it serves an interesting purpose because, in fact, if we look at how people react to, and this is another American thing, react to COVID, people are looking for the conspiracy theory or the person to blame. And was it the Illuminati or maybe Bill Gates did it or all these crazy theories? Well, one, the American experience does explain we do have theories, but two, the thing that you should go after, it turns out it's all written here, right? It's like 200 years of stuff we've done that added up to why things kind of turned out this way.
It was kind of easy for COVID to take us to our knees.
Yeah.
But
if you can, no, I was just thinking about like when you were showing that, Terry, it's like that timeline isn't just for COVID, right? You had the red things in COVID, but I think about like, how do we start to create these in systems of systems of systems, right? Where like so many things on that map all in the American experience impact other topics, right? So they're all interrelated. So it's really like thinking about, can we take this piece and connect it and do projections on other topics that are going to be, or other wicked problems, right?
Dutch, you're exactly right. And that touches on another really important topic that I want to mention. We've just written a chapter in a book on urban planning about this, and that is wicked problem clusters. And we've delivered dozens of lectures in the past 3 months around this COVID thing, and there are people literally from all over the world dialing in. And I always say COVID has become the great provocateur in every single country. But what it provokes in different cultures and different places are different. And what we've seen here is COVID-19 lit up what we call a wicked problem cluster of COVID-19, our broken healthcare system, racism, and police brutality. And they're all completely lit up right now. And as overwhelming and tragic as that is, if you can read systems dynamics, it's also opening up opportunities to drive positive systems level change. So one of the things I always throw out to the audience when I do this, the COVID lecture, is what are the problem clusters that COVID is lighting up where you are? And they're almost always different.
There's a beautiful Radiolab episode that just came out that's reports from 1918. And it's actually a deep history look at why did India get its independence because of the 1918 influenza virus. Why did World War II happen and the League of Nations fail because of the 1918 virus? So they actually look through history and they do kind of a long now version, and it's kind of a beautiful episode. It's sort of reports from 1918 when it was actually considered just a wrath of God thing. I mean, you know, it wasn't like anybody can control the virus. So it was reported on like page 22 on the New York Times, you know, when so many million died because it wasn't something we thought we could control.
You're describing the grand intertwingledness, and of course, James Burke's Connections is filled with this, right? And of course, the granddaddy of so many of these things is why the Black Death led to the increased power of labor, the end of monarchy, the rise of the individual, and all that stuff. One thing I wanted to share with you, Terry, is the work of a person who's influenced both of us, Dana Meadows, who this concept of modeling systems so that you both identify pieces of it as you've done, and then you talk about their behaviors. So, you know, if you kill off one species and the predator goes away, then the other species will start growing. And if the food supply is constant, it will overshoot and collapse. And so you start seeing the behavior of this system as a verb, as something that's living. And then, of course, if you have a computer, you can make it go and see what happens. And this, of course, is kind of the basis of a lot of the behavior that we now have in world games and stuff like that. In the late 70s, when I was in school, Dana and Dennis Meadows had built a language called Dynamo that was built on work that Jay Forrester had done. And so they were teaching us how to do this, right? We would go model population phenomenon or ecological phenomenon. And as we were preparing for this show, we went back and Dana was actually teaching an hour course on how to model an epidemic, how to model the social, the economic, and then the pathogens. She was focusing on yellow fever, which had a lot to do with the behavior of people, the behavior of political systems, and the behavior of mosquitoes. Okay, so I want to show you a little bit of this.
Yeah.
Great.
Which is great, because this is actually the stuff of what you're doing. And so this is from a class, I think, in 1977. So Omid, let's go take a look at that.
It looks complicated, but in fact, it's in some ways simpler than the deer model. It's complicated because the flows of mosquitoes and persons are represented in quite a lot of detail. One thing that I thought was important was the delay times, the incubation periods, and things of that sort. And I wanted to get those in, and so I put it in explicitly. There's a mosquito flow up here, and there's a person flow down here. Let's take the person flow first, because we've talked about that. There's a level of vulnerable people. They become infected and go into an incubating people category, which means they haven't yet got the disease, but they're about to get it. Then there's a contagious category. In this stage, if they get bit by a mosquito, they transmit the yellow fever germ to the mosquito. Then they become visibly sick, and then they can go one of two ways. They can become immune or they can die. And in the mosquito case, I've taken the suggestions of the author, which you are free to change. In fact, I ask you to change it in the assignment. And have made a constant mosquito population which generates a certain number of new mosquitoes, a constant fraction of new mosquitoes each time period. And for a while, they're susceptible to biting someone with the infection and becoming infected. If they do so, they become incubating mosquitoes. It takes a few days before they can transmit the infection on. At the point where they become infectious, there's a very important connection here between the number of infectious mosquitoes and the actual infection rate of the humans.
All right, so that was
It's amazing.
Yeah, there's an hour.
Later in the lecture,
Amazing.
she actually programmed that
Amazing.
into Dynamo. And
Yeah.
by the way, I think Dynamo today is called IC. It's still out there. It's like literally from the 70s. But it's nowhere near what I would look for. I always look for like Tinkercad, which is used by, I don't know, 10 million people a month that are 6-year-olds to design physical things. There's no Tinkercad for system modeling.
Right.
It's all fairly tricky and complicated, and it feels like you have to have a degree in something to get it. And I'd love it at the 6-year-old scale first.
This is an important point about narrative. We have these incredibly sophisticated systems that all of us are using, certainly lots of kids are using, all of these gaming systems that are deeply powerful modeling things. We are modeling these fantasy worlds. But very rarely do we give people a game where the purpose of the game is figure out how you'd build your world that didn't collapse. Like go mess with the economy and production and supply chain and food and just make it all work out so that the human thing just goes on and people have some plenty, right? Which is really what you're talking about imagining a future and then doing a set of things, seeing how it works out, keep working it. You think of Disney. Current Disney invests an enormous in creating fantasies, all these shows, and then in creating fantasy places you go to in a theme park. Walt Disney actually did invest in imagining the future, the work he did talking about the space program, talking about the future cities, and had hoped that his Epcot would be a place where you went and the rides and the experience was kind of modeling things. And that just strikes me as a thing that's missing, that in this whole equation would be, those kinds of things would help us take this academic discipline and make it part of our lives.
Well, Peter, it's a really great point. And I think Hollywood has been, seeding the future for years, haven't they? I feel so strongly that this foresighting ability is an essential design skill that a few years ago we hired Stuart Candy, who's a fairly well-known futurist, to join our faculty. And Stuart, for the last 3 years, has been creating a foresighting thread that actually runs throughout our undergrad curriculum and up into the master's. Because I think this skill of learning to think rigorously about the future is something humans once had and we lost. The idea of the seventh generation is not a detergent that Whole Foods came up with. It was actually, a Native American concept that, any important decision that you were going to make, you had to think about how it was going to affect the seventh generation. We know how to do this, and we knew how to do that because we were embedded within nature. We are no longer, and so we've forgotten it. And I think a lot of these foresighting approaches, or this newly awakened interest in thinking rigorously about the future, is sort of bubbling up, and I think we should embrace it.
We're coming up, we're after 5, of course, or after 7, after 8, I guess, your time. So we're kind of in the overtime segment, and I want to just give you the chance, if you have to bail, it's a Friday night, please feel free to bail whenever you have to. But we love the overtime. If you can stay on for a little while longer, I'd love to explore, and maybe Dutch, can you talk a little bit about, either what you're seeing, you've worked on both the physical spaces, but also business side of things, and you've worked at city scale. I mean, you've worked with Pittsburgh and with other regions to really think about how we make transitions with cities. Where do you see that going? Where do you see one of those threads?
Yeah. Well, it's really interesting because, if you're really looking at what is sort of cutting edge in thinking about systems and cities, it's almost going back to sort of containing what you do. So some of the biggest problems in cities right now are waste sewage management, right? So older cities, particularly the East Coast and in the Midwest, were built with combined stormwater systems. So when it rains, you have these massive overflows which pollute the environment, go into rivers, cause environmental damage. And many of these cities have been under mandate by the federal government to do something, Pittsburgh being one of them as well. And most of the solutions were kind of thinking about, okay, we need to build more infrastructure, bigger holding tanks, treat more wastewater, massive systems that were going to cost a lot of money. And economically were not viable. But some people started thinking about, okay, wait, let's think about this a little bit differently, right? And so let's think about, why does the stormwater need to leave my building or my home? Why does it need to come off the buildings downtown or skyscrapers and go into the river, right? Or go into the sewage system. And so there's a lot of thinking around, like, how do we tie these systems together and think about, oh, well, I need water for drinking. I need water for taking care of my plants. I need water on my farm. And a lot of the solutions coming out are thinking about the earth needs water to feed the aquifers, from which many of us are getting our drinking water. And so I think it's that kind of thinking that we're starting to see, which is really interesting, which is more sustainable, more long-term, and thinking about like how do I manage the problem more locally? And I think we're also seeing that, if you're familiar with the term district-wide energy, where, there was this time in the 20th century where we just want to build bigger systems and move, during the Depression, when we were building the electrification for rural areas, like creating these centralized systems that push power or water or whatever across the nation. And now what we're seeing is like, that's a fragile system. What we can do is start thinking about, like, maybe I can just generate what I need, right? And maybe I can do it either for my neighborhood and reduce all the friction of moving energy around, use less energy. Maybe I can generate everything I need right, on my own roof. And it's really, Terry's talking about history. It's really sort of going back to these things we used to do, like the patterns we used to have. We did what we did on our farm or our home or whatever. People talk about COVID, like work from home. Like before the Industrial Revolution, everybody worked from home.
Yeah.
It's just what you did, right? So I do think there is a moment in time where we're thinking, or where people are starting to think about the systems of inputs and outputs, whether that's water and wastewater or whatever those things are, and thinking about how might we, in an urban environment, in a regional environment, kind of do those things in a more sustainable way. So I have a lot of, maybe I'm an optimist in this thing, but there's a lot of forces against these sort of, these are very wicked problems, and
well,
nobody makes money if I generate my own energy, right?
And certainly there are a lot of forces that are pushing us towards more distributed, resilient, anti-fragile systems. Energy, the best example here in California. It's both inexpensive now, and the centralized grid sometimes blows out, and you see the same thing.
Right.
And another guest we had on this show, I love how these things, you always feel like this is like the end of some season, because all the threads are coming together here, or maybe we're off about to redesign our world.
You're the only one who sees it, Peter.
When we had Kent Larson on from the MIT Sensible Cities Lab, Kent has been doing a project with Sir Norman Foster called Cities Without. It's handling sewage without
it's sort
sewers.
of infrastructuration.
Nice. Money without banks, sewers without sewers, transportation without roads, on and on and on. But essentially, and this stuff is incredibly, you can easily see why you would need this in developing countries where you can't afford it, or in cities where the population is just growing faster than you could possibly get the storm drains into it, right? But then, of course, suddenly this COVID moment makes us realize or reimagine, like we've all become more local, right? We're just more aware of the need for local food chains, local production. I would love to ask you this, maybe Terry, how have things changed in terms of people's appreciation of this or awareness since COVID, or how do we take advantage of this moment of disruption and certainly realization that we've got a whole bunch of systemic things to deal with, which is, kind of like what's going on in the political race, but in a way that, like,
how do we ingrain new habits? I think, because I worry about this sort of snapback, where the minute people can actually go back to the offices, they're going to go back to the offices. And people who are on Zoom are going to be second-class citizens. And you're going to be like ignored in a conference room. Or, the minute they snap back, we're suddenly going to have highway traffic that's crazy, and you're going to be sitting in traffic for an hour to get to your office, and we're going to have the big buses. What are things we could do that take advantage of this moment? I do like that question, and I just wonder how we build new habits. Habits of mind, or new design.
That's like the $100,000 question. I don't know, but the two things that spring to mind are narrative. How can we continue to drive a narrative about how this is a moment of opportunity to try and drive positive systems level change? And I think the longer that our normal is suspended, the better chance we have of creating a more powerful narrative. And we have to kind of ignore the national political narrative. It's just, let's just call it for what it is. It's bullshit. You can't pay attention to it. So if ever there was a time for grassroots, city level and regional action, this is it. My husband is such a big advocate of this book called If Mayors Ruled the World. And my husband's English.
Ruled the world. Okay.
Yeah.
Gideon seem like cities are like the laboratories of.
Exactly.
Somebody once said they're big enough to matter. They're small enough to know everybody. to figure it out, kind of thing.
That's right.
Laboratory.
And Gideon
What
and I
it's called,
met
if mayors ruled the world.
If
By
Mayors
Ben
Rule the
Barber.
World.
It was Ben Barber's last book before he passed away. And Ben Barber was trying to build after this a global forum of mayors. He wanted a World Economic Forum of mayors. But a lot of us thought maybe you don't need a global top-down forum of mayors. Maybe you need some highly distributed mechanism where cities are sharing and working together and coming up with things, right? But he made the point that geopolitically, it was the mayor that was making the decision more than the national.
That's exactly right. And my husband Gideon, his background's in social ecology and anarchy studies, but he's English. And so, there isn't a week goes by that I don't say to him, should we move back to the UK now? And he actually really likes it here. He likes Carnegie Mellon, and he thinks that, actually the size of the US could be its redemption. And one of his areas of research is cosmopolitan localism. And the idea that for the first time in human history, we are globally interconnected in real time, instantaneous. And cosmopolitan localism runs the argument that change needs to be place-based and local, yet cosmopolitan in its global awareness and sharing of information and expertise. And we are really at that moment right now, where something like the death of an individual like George Floyd at the hands of police in a city like Minneapolis went global. And it sparked riots all over the world and has elevated the awareness of systems of oppression and privilege and racism. And so how do we drive that narrative about systems level change and the fact that even something as horrible as COVID-19 has opened up the opportunity for systems level change? So I think, again, we come back to the importance of driving narrative. At the same time, we look deeply at how our own patterns of behavior have changed for the good in the midst of tragedy.
But I wonder if this tragedy partly is because of the quiescence that we had, because we anesthetized ourselves and put proxies between us and the physical world and between us and tangible stuff. And as we got farther and farther away, we actually had this sort of stasis that allowed structured racism, structured oppression, other kinds of things, actually to percolate for hundreds of years. And it's only the existentialism of the threat that opens up the levers. It just goes, everything's off. Figure it out.
Yeah. I just want to do a plug for this amazing book that we're going to retool the transition design seminar, which is up online and available for anybody to use. But this is kind of an amazing book that I've been reading, which not only talks about systems of oppression and privilege and racism, but it actually proposes measures for restitution. And anybody concerned with systems problems and how to address them, I think, would be interested in that. It just came out this year.
Terry, I was really interested in what you were saying. About the hyper local piece of this as well, because what I'm hearing a lot when you're talking is this sort of like there's in solving these problems, sort of the top down and the bottom up.
Yes,
I think that's what I'm hearing.
Yes,
and like oftentimes the bottom up voices are the ones that don't have agency, right? And so, or the type of agency one, but these hyper local solutions where you start to think about like the connectedness at my curb, the connectedness at the street, the connectedness of what I do on a daily basis can actually make a difference. And we're seeing something that's really interesting, I think, in that way, where things like eco districts, where people are just like starting to say, like, we can solve these problems by coming together and not worrying about how they happen necessarily, but how we can work together. And it starts with that conversation, which I think is woefully missing so often. I don't know if you know Candy Castleberry Singleton.
No.
She's the director of diversity for Twitter, but she was in Pittsburgh for a long time working at one of the medical centers. And I was on a panel with her, and she was talking to business leaders about diversity. And she said something that has stuck with me this day, which is very simple. Like, if you really want to make a difference, once a month, buy a cup of coffee for someone who looks completely different than you and have a conversation.
Yeah.
And that'll actually start to change the world. And I really believe that.
Yeah.
And I think, these hyper local, I don't know, you said it beautifully, that the Gideon local, what did you say? Gideon.
Cosmopolitan localism.
Yeah, where there's these micro interactions that have local, that have amplification to change the world are really important.
I mean, one thing I would say to anyone who's interested in systems change and transition, I don't think there's any body of work out there that has influenced Gideon and I. And Gideon Kossoff and I and Cameron Donkamwise sort of hatched this transition design conversation. There is a group out there, you guys, called the Socio-Transition Sustainability Network. It's STRN. And these people are kind of crazy in that they have been studying how socio-technical systems transition over decades. They've been looking at this for years. And their theory is, if we begin to understand the anatomy of large systems transitions historically, then it will enable us to intervene so that we can change the trajectory of future transitions. And these are largely Dutch and Northern European scholars who are not designers. They're like scientists, engineers, sociologists. And I can tell you that reading this stuff is a bit of a slog, but they have proposed a framework called the multi-level perspective tool, and it divides socio-technical systems into 3 levels: the landscape, where large events happen; the middle level, the regime or the status quo, which is where we all live; and the niche, which is where experimental ideas, inventions, and technologies can percolate off the radar and eventually bubble up and transform things at the regime level. This has given us a tool for understanding the dynamics of how change happens. And I cannot recommend it highly enough. We started going to their conferences like years ago, and they had no idea of what design was or who designers were. And we just showed up as a soft discipline that we're like, well, what about this? And what about this? And we had to write rigorous papers. But we have sort of infiltrated their ranks now. And we showed up at the conference in Ottawa last summer, and they are all of a sudden aware that designers have some role to play. So I just cannot recommend more highly going into this territory if you're interested in big systems level change. It's taught me a tremendous amount.
I'm scared to read that because you said it's a bit of a slog.
It's a slog.
I like looking at the sort of translational layer. Like if you ended up, you and your husband and other kind of creators of the movement at CMU ended up like kind of beginning to embed those methods into your coursework and the way that you communicate it probably ends up as a translation layer or transduction layer for me. But I do like the idea of hearing about new kinds of conferences or new kinds of places that are anti-disciplinary or transdisciplinary. Within BCG, where Dutch is at, there's a wonderful newsletter by Massimo Portancaso, who's in the Berlin office, a partner. It's called The Anti-Disciplinarian. And he is just super passionate about finding the places in between and exploring that space. And it's maybe one of my favorite newsletters to read because he really reflects deeply on this. And he was a partner at BCG, then he left.
That would be great.
And yeah, I'll post it. But he left. He started his own Italian restaurant in Berlin. He ended up,
That's great.
exploring. So he's really tried lots of different things. but a wonderful thinker and doer. I wanted to mention that in the comments, one of our viewers mentioned Surviving Mars was an interesting simulation game that we could explore. Brooks Kenavisi. And then I want to point out there was another one. I was at Games for Change last year, which is a wonderful festival at Parsons in New York around games for social good and change. And there was this wonderful talk about Plague, where you play the Plague. It's a real-time strategy game developed by Endemic in the UK. And the creator of it was there. And he talked about how different it was to actually have characters called the CDC and others. And this was, of course, before the pandemic. And he said it's one of the most popular games on the planet, you know, in terms of a massive multiplayer game, and there's a board game version of it. But you play the Plague. So your job is to try to thwart the CDC, to thwart the whatever. And the topic of that talk, it was a beautiful talk. It also had the developer of SimCity, one of the later versions, SimCity 2015. And the whole point of the talk was the donut hole of simulation. In other words, you always have to choose what you don't put in the simulation. And in SimCity 2014 or 2015, the lead developer trying to develop it, the designer, could not find a way to solve for homelessness. Looked at every single précis on homelessness in large cities, and basically ended up creating yellow people who at a certain population level started showing up on the streets of whatever town you made in SimCity. And Electronic Arts would get all this mail saying there's a bug, all these yellow people keep showing up, they're homeless people. And actually EA, props to them, had to send a note out and say that is not a bug, that is a feature. If you have any ideas how to solve homelessness at this scale,
let us know.
Tell us, and we'll put it in the simulation. But you know, the donut hole helps kind of illuminate things, and with Plague, being the Plague allowed you to kind of explore the missing understanding of humans and things.
Well, that's taking the other perspective.
Very beautiful. And I love that Brooke brought up Surviving Mars. I do think that, and Peter mentioned this at the beginning or earlier, that games can help us explore this because we can accelerate time and try what ifs and hit initial conditions. I just wish we had better tools, maybe, to go back.
Oh, God, we need better tools.
Tools for thinking. Wicked clusters was a great thought too, and I just like that was interesting because, and it goes maybe to what Dutch was saying too. This notion that these things are not; they are all intertwingled. But one thing is like an accessory to the other murder, and the other murder is an accessory to something else, to some amazing positive thing. It's not necessarily all negatives. It's you know, because of the pandemic, Gandhi was knocked up for 2 years trying to fight off the flu after he was trying to recruit British soldiers in India, and basically came out of it saying, okay, maybe nonviolence might be a better trick. And so had the pandemic not happened, India might not have gotten independence at the time it did. So we also have to look at the sort of second order effects, and it's very hard for humans. I do notice there's one game that some Stanford designers and researchers came up with called It Came from the Future, or The Thing from the Future. And what I like about the game, it's a card deck game, but they actually took a very scientific kind of complexity approach. They said, what's the time scale? 50 years, 100 years, 500 years, 5 years. So set the time scale. What kind of future is it? Is it a structured future, like people have kibitzes and they have very structured religious or ritualistic things? Is it a downward future? Is it a rebirth future? And then what's the domain of life? Is it your personal life, your professional life? Is it living underwater? Is it living on land? And then what's the thing? What's the thing from the future? And you have to come up with like a postcard or a food truck or whatever. And it's a very fascinating exploration. It's a very generative game. But because it has a little structure, I'm very impressed with it. And Terry, and it was developed by somebody who did the research on it.
Terry, what was the newsletter written by the woman who's an historian but uses history to talk about us every day?
That's
her name is Heather Cox Richardson. And if you Google her, you can sign up you can subscribe as a supporter for $50 a year. And she runs a blog and interacts with people, but you can sign up for her email. And every day, the next morning, you will get her email synopsis of what happened in the news the day before. And it is absolutely interlaced with historical references that are absolutely relevant and spot on. It will make you feel like I feel like I never want to be on a team again without a historian and an anthropologist of some kind.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Dutch, last thoughts? I know we're getting late for the East Coast.
The sun is set. I can see how.
It's dark in Pittsburgh where Dutch and I are.
Dark in Pittsburgh. Still sunny here. Very hot
Dutch
today.
and I are literally 2 blocks away from each other.
Oh, are you really?
About, yeah.
Dutch, last thoughts?
I just really want to dig more into this idea of the layers of the systems and how, from the individual to the next layer to the next, because, from my perspective, I really believe that a lot of change starts at home and very locally, and understanding those viewpoints can make, I guess, Terry, you call them the innovators, but they're the ones that are actually going to start to impact the system, almost like an infection vector. Not to talk about infections in COVID times, but something that's going to actually infect the system and make the change.
Yeah.
Well, and Dutch, I want to say something. I mean, we probably could have a whole nother episode. I just want to dig deeper into some of the work you've been doing. But I have to say that one of the things I noticed when you were a client of mine, when Maya was kind of suggested to help out with this Carnegie Library project because of you and Edge, what I noticed that you did incredibly well was sort of code switching at different levels, from the individual to the community, you and Becky as well, sort of to the space, all the way up to the mayor, all the way to the community. And there were just people, you would have parties at home that I just felt like I met more people tonight from different walks of life, from sort of different, let's say, transdisciplinary, different socioeconomic walks of life, different, basically different stakeholders. And you did a wonderful job of sort of helping create a psychological safe place for the conversations, for the passion to come up. Because I think with all of these problems, one of the biggest problems is self-doubt and a lack of agency when it seems too big, right? So Terry has talked about, we've got to open the frame, but the minute we open the frame, it makes it daunting. And daunting.
But that's what's super
that.
important about stakeholders, though.
Yeah.
And I think Terry brought it up. It's like you need to create that opportunity for somebody who sees the system as too daunting to engage, but is going to have a really important role in changing
they're
it.
going to actually be the lever.
Creating that space for people to have a conversation where you can actually find out something that you will never find out for your own frame of reference, right? And I think
you can't.
And I think that's super important.
And what I would build on what both of you have said is, as somebody who lives in the neighborhood with Dutch, and he was one of the first people to welcome us here when we moved here in 2009, is, he walks his talk. Dutch and Becky, his wife, are just like anchors in the neighborhood. But we live in a very diverse neighborhood. And I think probably what condition, I don't know, I want to speak for you, Dutch, but I'm speculating what came into my head. I think Peter's characterization of the political polarization that's going on in this country is spot on. And yet, in our neighborhood, we have people on our block that are Trump supporters. I know they are. And we've got them all over the neighborhood. We've got a neighbor on the next street that walks up and down with a Glock in his pocket. But the thing I've learned from
Pittsburgh.
Nobody ever thinks they'll move to Pittsburgh, but you love it once you're here.
You might be surprised. I'm a Chicago.
Even my English husband.
Yeah.
But The
So,
thing
but
I
yeah.
think that I've learned from systems work is you have to concentrate on the local and where your mutual interests are and where your mutual future is. And you will never reach agreement or consistence. But if you convene on behalf of creativity and common interests, then you will be able, I think, to transcend those things that you'll never agree on. How many of us have families that you get into fights with at Thanksgiving? That is just the human condition, right? But I think systems force you to think about where your common interests lie. And I think our little neighborhood of friendship is a perfect example of that.
Yeah. I'll tell one local story and then I'm going to go get a glass of wine.
I already got one.
Yeah. Dutch, I don't know what you're doing. You got to bring it.
I'm
You got to bring the
water.
wine.
Yeah.
We're not endorsing
when
wine.
When I graduated from architecture school, I set up this program I was really passionate about called Our Town. And what it was to use your neighborhood as a laboratory, work with kids in neighborhoods, use the neighborhood as a laboratory to think about how they might be able to view their neighbor differently and think that maybe create some sort of change for the good. And there was one kid there, and actually I did it at the school in this neighborhood, Friendship. And his name was BJ. And we did a little oral history project where he went out and had to talk to people on the little main street here and talk to his family about the neighborhood. And about 5 years ago, there's a sneaker store that opened in the corner called Refresh, where they take classic sneakers, collectible sneakers, restore them and sell them. And I was walking by and I looked at it and there was this very tall guy and I looked at him and like, BJ? He's like, I'm Brian now. I'm like, what are you doing? He's like, I opened this shop because I wanted to do this my whole life. And I want to thank you, Mr. Dutch. He called me Mr. Dutch because I never thought I could do anything good in my neighborhood. I never thought my neighborhood was a place where I'd want to live when I could. I always just thought I'd get out of here as fast as I can. And I just thought like, just a tiny intervention, like, I don't know, 8 weeks after school, 8 times or whatever. And just setting someone on a trajectory changed the way they thought about their neighborhood to the point where they worked hard that they could start a business about something they're passionate about. And they wanted to be in their neighborhood on their street because they thought it made a difference. So, I think that's a little hook into system change, right?
Chaos.
I was coming in from this big city architecture thing, and he's coming from like, I could own a store in my neighborhood and be proud.
Yeah. Chaos and complexity theory says that a butterfly flapping its wings in the Amazon can start a hurricane in Southeast Asia.
Yeah.
And I love that. It's so hopeful.
Yeah, that's perfect. Hey, Peter, you're always the one who takes us out of these episodes. You had a picture in your art collection of Buckminster Fuller's drawings of a city. Do you want to share that? Do you want to wait for another episode? Your call. We are in Blur's Day today, so we don't even know what time or day it is.
Yeah. So Omid, let's do the Buckminster Fuller picture, and then I'm going to talk about the Localist Manifesto when we end up. So this, this show always ends up referring to either Marshall McLuhan or Buckminster Fuller about something from his, I think, 1924.
They sometimes visit us as visitors as well.
When he was very young, and he had a sense for how you could do things sustainably and in new ways. He wrote this manifesto, which he mimeographed and handed out. This page, this image here, I think.
What year was this?
I think 24, 28.
Wow.
1924. Okay.
Yeah.
And this is from his mimeographed thing, and you happen to have you bought it for your art collection.
Systems, think through more sustainably. Here's more natural forms. And so he mimeographed it because that's how you make copies of things. And then he sent it to kind of everybody who was important in the design in the city world. And it was kind of like, who's this guy? And fast forward to the future, there aren't a lot of copies of this mimeographed thing left. In fact, this one page was sold last year to the Museum of Modern Art here in San Francisco. I think they bought 2 pages and they were each 10 or 20,000 each. What are we looking at?
This is
looking out over the wing of a Dymaxion
Plane wing. Yeah. Plane, clearly. It's a
Dymaxion aircraft.
Dymaxion plane, probably. Yeah.
To our right, we probably have Treasure Island and Yerba Buena Island, and just beyond that, in Oakland, is a Dymaxion apartment building, which was simply self-assembled because a crane just lifted it up and it folded out like an accordion. Prescient, because we are once again talking about putting in cheaper, more flexible manufactured housing in Oakland to handle the homeless problem, which we pointed out before. Electronic Arts needed some help on. So,
Peter, don't you have a picture in your collection as well? Is it a different picture?
Yeah, I have different ones. So Fuller never actually did fine art, except in the 70s, he worked with the Carl Soloway Gallery, which also represented Nam June Paik and John Cage. So very diverse people. And so the one that I have is it's kind of a Dymaxion house blueprint, and then on top of it is a piece of acetate with images of Fuller and a bunch of his markups on the whole thing. So yeah, it was very exciting to talk to Mr. Fuller downstairs, and it's very exciting to see which of my friends that come over. Back when people actually came over, were completely animated because. As we wrap up, the point that Dutch just made, or that actually Terry and Dutch just made, about the power of localism, which is on a national level, we are divided. In fact, our friend Jim Fallows, who's also been on the show, in his book, Our Towns, the thesis of this book is he, as a man who's lived in Asia for a lot of his life, coming home with his wife, Deb, as a foreign correspondent, went and looked at this strange place, America. And what he found is, well, on the national level, there was a Jeremiah that everything was falling apart. When you went locally, everyone said, "Oh, America sucks, but boy, are we doing great here in our town." And boy, are we inventing.
We're inviting immigrants in. Look, we're reanimating our riverfront. Look, and he actually, when he was on the show, he said something really powerful. We asked him, because he was a scriptwriter for Jimmy Carter, maybe, when he was in the. Yeah. We said, what would your campaign be, for the Biden-Harris, I guess at this point, election, or what would your campaign be for any presidential election? He said, right now it would be, we can do better than this. we are better than this. That would be the whole thing. And I think he's right. And I think the question is, how do we turn levers on these structural efforts? How do we learn from history? But how do we make sure we don't throw the baby out the bathwater? Because there's been a slow accumulation of some amazing positive things. The fact that someone who is born of two immigrants, right, Indian and Jamaican, is the vice presidential candidate, Kamala, and the idea that that there have been some progress, but there's also probably a need for a truth and reconciliation. There's probably a need for refactoring of a lot of things. How do we balance the fractal vascularization of any complex system so that we don't try to tear it out at its root? How do we balance the best parts and also get the change in a positive direction for more people in the world? And I think that seems like one of the big challenges, Terry, that you're facing with how do you raise another generation of people to take this seriously and not think of themselves as the expert, the pro, the turtleneck wearing San Francisco IDEO guy who shows up and says, I've got the answers. But instead, take a different tack and say, what do we learn from design? What do we learn from the methods? But how do we foster a much bigger conversation with many more stakeholders? Terry, any last words from you in terms of where it's going?
Yeah, well, that's a really big question, Mickey. I mean, I think the thing I'm most concerned about as an educator is how do we teach critical thinking skills? Because we're living in an era, and I think we've been seeing this slow march since Reagan, at least, to creating narratives where the world is black or white. It's good or evil. It's us, it's them. And that coupled with the defunding of education has led to generations and generations of people who want it to be simple. Just give it to me in binary terms. And I think we need to emphasize the importance of nuance, shades of gray, critical thinking, and systems literacy. And I think that needs to start right away, urgently, at the primary school level, because within a couple of generations, then we'd have a different world. But I think each of us, I suppose the challenge for each of us is, how do you build a bridge to somebody who thinks exactly the opposite of what you do? I mean, I have members of my family like that. And so I think we all just need to think in terms of our family, who, you know, you may have people that are politically 180 degrees away from you, and how do we all engage in trying to build those bridges towards a future? It's cliche, but I think that's kind of the work of, it's the great work, as Thomas Berry said, of the 21st century.
I like this idea of the shift away from black-white reductionist thinking. It really goes to almost what Peter started this with, which is the entanglement. You know, when you learn about quantum computing, which is a very strange animal.
Yeah.
Julie Love, who's the co-lead of the Microsoft Quantum Computing Initiative, said it's easy to think about quantum computing and how it's different than binary computing. Binary is flipping a coin and you get a head or a tail. Quantum computing is spinning a coin and you have an infinite number of possibilities between 1 and 0. And when you slap it, you get the answer. And I think we need to actually expand to this infinite entangled set of possibilities and understand the intertwingling that Ted Nelson talked about. We should get, is Ted still alive? We should get him on a show.
Oh, yes, Ted I think now a fellow at the Internet Archive. Right, yes, absolutely, we get Ted.
Okay, Peter, take us out.
Well, we've certainly created the agenda for the next several episodes, because there's a lot of work to do, right? There's content and narrative work to do. There's kind of a shared game and experience here. And I think translating all of this emerging work that's going on in complexity in academia and figuring out how it becomes popular and fun and part of what we all do and can practice, that's going to be the interesting thing. And we're going to do it all together with everyone here. So we'll get back to that. So a final thought here, because the Dutch, you were talking about, and Terry also, the national, we're talking about kind of the national polarity. Doing things locally really is the answer. You just made that point, Terry. And the book that I did a couple of years ago called The Maker City, we followed that up with some work we're doing at USC with a short document called The Localist Manifesto. Can we put that up for a sec, Omid? And we'll give you the link to it. It's on our Maker City site. But after kind of a convening and a whole bunch of people, actually what I want to do to Omid is just scroll and show the 8 ways to take action, right? So in this thing, there's a manifesto on the right, and you can go read it. But, one thing was, go find some problem and prototype and mess with it and come up with some experimental new thing. Working on public space and the reimagining of public space. Find actual stories.
Keep scrolling, Omid.
And sell those, huh?
I just said to Omid, keep scrolling.
Get everybody to run for office. So important to do that. Using local media to tell stories. So there's this is just like based on stuff that we saw, but right. And the rebuilding after this pandemic is going to be a profoundly local thing. And it's going to take a lot of thinking. How do you spin up local businesses after so many of them went bankrupt? We're talking about more local supply chains, but what we kept open was Amazon and Costco, right? So we're heading into a world that's going to be ripe. And of course, Pittsburgh, you'll be doing a lot of experiments in Pittsburgh. We're going to keep the conversation going. Mick, you know what it is right now, don't you?
Is it quarantine yet?
It's 5:53 Pacific quarantine. Of course, it's 8:50.
Thank you, Terry.
Dutch has to go have dinner. Terry needs to go get some wine, and we're going to beach here.
Well, it was great to see you all. Great to meet you, Peter, and see Mickey and Dutch again. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Have a great weekend.
Thanks for having us. Really enjoy it.
Yeah.
All right. we'll see you again next week. Mickey, what's next week? We know what's next
Wednesday. Week? Yeah, Wednesday we have my sister, Alana Mertens in Chicago, who's been working with DePaul University for years as a math teacher in the Chicago public schools, and has been working on a multi-year effort to look at how you get kids to fall in love with math the way they fall in love with music. And she'll be reporting from the front of that in terms of building peer communities of teachers who at kindergarten fall in love with math, even in some of the roughest neighborhoods in Chicago public schools. And Shraddha Chaplat, who's a math wizard, who at the age of 4 could probably sequence pi out to 24 digits, who is doing some amazing work. So Wednesday will be a teacher's show about what to prepare for the fall semester with Alana and Shraddha. And then Friday is going to be our next generation episode, where we actually have a college intern, Jocelyn, and a high school intern, Kira, who are going to talk about what they care about from their generation. So that's kind of exciting because we have no idea what they care about. And if we're going to be good ancestors, and I'd flag, like, this is a great book about being good ancestors, The Optimist Telescope by Bina Venkataraman. We have to listen to them. And so we decided to do a next generation episode. And then in forthcoming episodes, we're actually going to have Scott Parrish from LinkedIn and Karan Chopra from Opportunity at Work to look at how we could take 60 or 70 million Americans who have low-wage jobs because they don't have a bachelor degree. And if you could just waive the bachelor degree, you might find out that they have skills through other routes, stars. And they've done an analysis of 60 or 80 million Americans to look at pathways that can go from $15 an hour to $45 an hour. If you could just get past the algorithmic bias that is the recruiting systems in these very large companies, the tech companies. Reid Hoffman is on their board from LinkedIn, and we're going to have Scott from LinkedIn talk about some amazing efforts with getting more than 1 million people jobs in healthcare over the COVID epidemic, and a lot of volunteerism, probably about 500,000 people that get connected to volunteer work. So we've got some fun episodes coming
as we work on the future. Thanks, Mickey. Thank you so much, Dutch and Terry. Omid, thank you, and Jocelyn. And
thanks, Omid. Thanks, Jocelyn. Thanks, Kara. Thanks, everybody.
Okay, it's now 5:57 Pacific Quarantine. Thank you, and we're out of here.
Run the credits.
Let's get close, but not so close. You can share from a distance or in time. You know we want to see each other. You'll have to stay in your quarantine space while we talk. Quarantine.